It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm full of impressions after Gil's talk. But I hope we can bring some more with David Bridwell, and the title is Brainwaves, Music, Movies, and More. So, starting with who is David? A, neuroscientist. B, marketing expert. Musician. People scientist. Or all the above. I think you are guessing by now. So, just a few quick words. I got to know David when he was in Mind Research Network in the group of Vince Calhoun, and he produced some of the great scientific work, some of which involved music, speech, movies, and the rest. I encourage you highly to check him out on Google Scholar. This is something that he shared now about himself, so I'm just going to read it. He's interested in understanding how real-world experiences interface with social media to change society in real time. Understanding the ebb and flow of ideas that emerge within this complex social landscape, and understanding human behavior where it really matters. How we choose to spend our money and how we choose to spend our time, which is of special interest to me. I have more time than money. So let's see what he has to say about that. I'm Ivan Ligurevich. I had the MVP, which makes mobile EEG equipment such that it's easy to set up and that you don't spend too much time on setting your experiments. And I'm going to give the floor here to David.
Thanks, Ivan. And I really enjoyed that previous talk, and thought it was interesting how you brought up the whole social media and how the interface between humans and technology is going to manifest as a society. That's one of the things that drove me in the directions that I'm going in, because I think that this is a fascinating time in terms of humans have been in a situation where we're not used to interacting with information like we are today. It's never been like that before. So we don't necessarily know how that's going to impact culture and how that's going to impact human technology or human psychology and the way we create things and everything. And so turning to that question was a super interesting question for me. And we're already, like the whole robot thing is super interesting to think about. How are we going to use artificial intelligence combined with humans to actually create together? Because it's not just about the artificial intelligence and the robots and the machines or whatever. It's about how we interact with them and how they respond and how we together create something that, again, we don't really know what it is. But we have the opportunity now to sit back and try to ask, like, what is it? Let's see. And the notion that the world we live in with social media, is heavily impacted by algorithms. And we're seeing so many things where there's a lot of conflict on certain social media platforms, and it shapes the way that people do things. It shapes people's desire to go out and do events because they think about, can I communicate that event on social media? And so on, and the shift towards information. So the amount that we value information and the power of information going forward has huge political and economic implications. And we're just going to see how it goes. But today I'm going to come from a perspective of the brain. They talked about marketing and music, and so I'll be touching on that as well. So my experience was recording EEG responses, which is brain responses on the scalp when you put a sensor there. And the fact that you can put a sensor on the scalp and record brain voltage, brain activity, within like 5 minutes is amazing. And when they first discovered this about 100 years ago, it's attributed to Hans Berger. He didn't believe that it was true. And you can imagine if you're playing around with some sensor and all of a sudden you see that you're measuring these squiggles. Like, would you really think that it's actually picking up some activity from the brain that's making its way through the extracellular fluid and the skull and the scalp to be picked up? But it turns out it's possible. And that's just a fascinating thing to reflect on. So what is this measuring when we do this? A useful analogy is to think of a symphony. And this is the analogy that my grad school advisor, Ramesh Srinivasan, used in his book, which is that where you put your measurement device affects how you perceive something. And so the electrode on the brain is like putting a microphone far away so that you can capture the aggregate sounds of the symphony. As opposed to, say, putting it right next to one of the instruments where you get a very good picture of that instrument, but you don't quite get the sound as it was intended. And so you have to put it in the right spot where it basically combines all of the activities and generates something that is a sort of emergent phenomenon from the collective activity of all of the participants. So that's what the EEG can be viewed of as measuring in terms of the actual brain that's underneath the scalp near it. Now, think about what the actual brain is doing on a day-to-day basis while we're all sitting here looking at this. If we were to put those sensors on, it would look something like this in terms of the fluctuations in activity. So you constantly have a certain brain area that's engaging and then moving around and dissipating, and it's happening super quickly, faster than we can actually process, because it's doing the processing for us. Like if we could actually visually look at this, which hopefully appears as fast as it does on your screen, somewhat as it does on my screen, then if we could actually process it, the brain would have to work so much harder that we could now no longer understand it. So the perspective, the measurement tool that you use shapes your perspective of the brain, and that actually shapes your perspective of yourself and culture and society. You know, I think the audience here understands how much our ideas contribute, how we view ourselves as humans contribute to how we view ourselves as an individual and how we live our life. So this measurement is very much about these parallel, juxtaposed, superimposed systems. It's kind of like useful to think of it as a wave. So it's like very kind of chaotic. It's like a lava formation. And in his book, Buzaki talks about, the language would be synchrony. So it's synchrony. And this is the opposite of causality. And he says, I like this quote where he says, causality is the modern prejudice of the West. Because it's actually really difficult to deal with complexity and the notion that I can't just point to something and say, that's a circle layered on top of the brain. This is the thing of what it does. Here's an arrow that points to another area, and this is what that does. It's actually a lot more complex than that. But it's difficult to deal with that complexity. And this tension that exists in brain measures has an analogy. This tension between synchrony and causality is sort of language that goes into philosophy and ways of making decisions. And I would say that would be sort of heuristics, which is where art comes in and culture comes in. This is trying to see things from that outside perspective, the holistic perspective. And through art, we convey things that are very complicated. Like we don't quite understand the information when we see an image like this that somebody is taking home from it, but it communicates some type of information to others, and that affects change, and maybe we're not prepared to articulate it. But obviously it's critical for human culture. The analytical sort of opposite is to turn things into their parts and assign a purpose to every piece of that part and put it all together. And so the thinking about the complexity of humans, I think as artists, it's pretty easy to think of examples where we can be compelled by something that we don't quite understand. Gil was talking about how much music influences him, and that's just a feeling. It's a feeling of connection with others. And so looking at this Garth Brooks documentary that I recently watched, he was about to record a song for his first album, which millions of people have heard, in the studio, and he did not have the piano part set in advance. This is not the analytical. This is what happens in the room and if magic is created. But he told the piano player, play like there's horses running through the snow. And this is for the song The Dance. So it's like, da-na-na-na. I don't have any music in my slides. But when you hear the music to that song, it's like, that actually does sound like horses running through the snow. So how do we do that as humans? Turn a sound into something that seems somewhat specific and visual. It's a very complicated question. So there's certain questions that you can address with the brain and with EEG, and certain questions that are difficult to address. So I'm going to look at some that we've been able to ask. And the first concerns the brain's response to music. So if you consider a scenario here where you have a musician playing to a crowd, if you were to record the brain of everybody in the audience and sum it all together while the music is playing, then there would be a common pattern that corresponds to the pattern of the music. So the brain engages to these stimuli and moves based on it. So that's what we did in this study here. We wanted to look at, can we find these brain areas that are sensitive to that musical structure? And so you have to create a situation where you can pull apart the complexity. I showed you how complex the moment-to-moment EEG is in terms of something that we know about the inputs that we're providing. And so if you take simple guitar notes, forming a scale, and present them one at a time, but so that they form a musical pattern compared to if they are randomized, then you're presenting to the brain something that you can characterize. So if you look at the frequency of the guitar notes, it's in 4 times a second, 8 times a second. That's what you're putting into the brain, and when you look at the brain response, that's what you can look for in terms of what's tracking the music. So you could see this is the average EEG response over this frontal electrode across these guitar notes. And you could see, for one, that it is aligning with the notes. You could see that there's these oscillations going on, and the period of them, they go about 8 times per second, which it happens to be twice the frequency of the guitar notes. So it's 4 times per second. So what happened is that if you look at how people process music, guitar notes presented as music, there's less processing involved in the brain when it forms a musical pattern. And that's the blue in that graph. So in red is when the notes are presented randomly without music, and blue is when they're structured to form a pattern. So when something in the environment forms a pattern, then you make a prediction about it, and when that prediction is correct, then you can continue on with your model of the world and your representation of the world. If that prediction is incorrect, then you have to re-engage and redevelop a model for the world. Try to understand, what are the new statistics of the environment? What can I expect now going forward? Because that's one of the critical issues that we face going about our day, is understanding what representing the world and interacting in that world. So we found a brain network that was sensitive to the musical aspect of the stimuli. And now that's an interesting question in terms of, what other things is this piece sensitive to? You can go in and measure in infants and their sensitivity to music, for those who maybe can't articulate it, or you can get aspects of people's sensitivity to music that maybe they themselves can't quite articulate. So the other piece about live music is that there's a human connection. And this is one of the things that fascinated me. I became a musician. I became a singer-songwriter and folk singer, and was fascinated by gauging the energy of the crowd and getting involved in the energy of the crowd. Like Gil talked about, what happens when you see music isn't prescribed often. If it's very good, it's something that is created between the singer and the audience. It's actually an interaction. And Garth Brooks is one of those like people that does that engages people so much. So that means that the singer has to have some model for how the world works. And the audience has to have a model. And when they are aligned with each other, then they can have shared experiences with each other and begin to create. And this is an aspect of communication, right? The language that I use to try to convey messages the words have to have similar meaning across people for those messages to have an impact. And this is what we looked at in this study. So here we're measuring EEG responses in two people at the same time and trying to understand what does it mean for brain responses in one person and the other person when they're effectively communicating information with each other and engaging with each other. And this is actually a super difficult question to answer scientifically. But if you consider an example, like you're just talking to somebody and they say, I took my dog for a blank. People will begin to fill that sentence in with, I took my dog for a walk. But if instead it was, I took my dog for a drink, then it's unexpected. And that means that the model of the world of the speaker who said, I took my dog for a drink, is different from the world of the listener who doesn't think about taking their dog for a drink. But with EEG responses, one of the main things that it's sensitive to is the amount of effort that individuals are engaging in conversation. And that should actually be aligned. Their shared meaning should be aligned with their effort. If they have the same understanding of language and what words mean, then they should show similar effort in most circumstances. So we showed that when the speaker is preparing something unexpected, when they have to come up with, okay, I'm going to finish this sentence with, I'm going to take my dog for a drink, the more amount of work that they had to do to come up with that unexpected or creative sentence ending, the stronger the response within the listener to that sentence ending. So that means that if it was a lot for the speaker to think about, then it was a lot for the listener to think about. Now, this should be a fundamental feature of successful communication. And it's super important in terms of all of these artistic creations that we've been talking about. So this story actually kind of brought me into the world of marketing, and not just the notion of myself going out and playing music and understanding the sort of complexity in which people influence each other based on art. But comedians do this sort of thing. They have to understand, have a model of the world that's similar to their audience and understand which things are going to be interesting. And often it is taking the dog for a drink. That's the standard sort of stereotype for how a joke goes, is that it's unexpected. Now, in marketing, that's a super important thing. It's, it engages people's attention when you do something that's unexpected. When you hear that unexpected word and your brain has to reorganize and try to understand and form a new meaning that it didn't have before. So empathy is a word that's thrown about a lot everywhere, basically. And in marketing, it's thrown about everywhere, that you need to be empathetic. But this is sort of a subtle view on what empathy actually means. It means that you have to understand a bit about how your viewers are viewing the world so that you can communicate a message quickly and effectively in a way that engages them, in a way that's intriguing. So this advertisement, this image, and by the way, I view marketing as a form of art. I think that good marketing is art, and if it's bad marketing, then it's bad art. Or it's, I guess it probably shouldn't even be considered art at all at that point, just to preserve our impression of it. But you get the message. This is a cheese that's made out of 98% milk. That's conveyed, and it's conveyed in a creative way that is unexpected enough that it'll get our attention and communicate efficiently and effectively. So I hope all of my little pieces there made some sense for you guys, and I appreciate your attention, and I've enjoyed participating in this.
Thanks, David. Thanks. It's a short time to describe all of the work you have done. Let me start with one question. Do you think that that there is something evolutionary in music, that there is a role, or it's just a consequence of, for instance, development of a speech process? Why do we enjoy it so much?
I think that, there's a lot of positive things about music. One, it could indicate safety. I think birdsong is like one example, is that if they're announcing that you're present, then their environment must be safe. And so that's one aspect. The other is that I think that it's primarily from a social perspective, is that it allows us to actually bond together. And if we can align together on our music, most likely we align together on a lot of other things, like our psychology, the way we think, and our ability to work together and cooperate on more than just music, but creating culture, creating structures that we can live in, and so on. It indicates that we can cooperate and create together.
Yeah, for me, it was interesting. In one of your papers, you compared the difference in the music perception in contrast with just some other regular beats, like in the oddball task, that is a known psychological task. So in a way, we perceive it differently. There is more value in it, and again, as you said, there seems to be less cognitive effort when we're listening to the music. Sort of, our brain almost behaves like it's predicting the logical continuation of that piece, like it's predicting that you're not going to take your dog for a beer, but for a walk. Say a few words about that.
Yeah, I think that there's a unique aspect about music, which is that we get drawn into the repetition. And I suspect, like, we don't really read a book 10 times, but we'll listen to the same song 1,000 times throughout our life or more. And most likely we get some dopamine and everything when we make a prediction about the world and it is correct. We get rewarded for that, and so that's probably happening quite a bit with music.
We have a question from Gunnar. I'm going to unmute him. Gunnar, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me now. Interesting topic, interesting presentation. I myself have been working with fMRI for a number of years now, and I've always wanted to start to work with EEG, but one of the main limitations, or one of the main strengths I've seen with fMRI and the showcases, is that it has quite a few examples where you actually can look at just a fMRI pattern and see what the person is thinking. And I haven't really seen that on the EEG in the same way. It seemed like you had something in this direction where you have these different notes, and you could see a 4 hertz something pattern. I couldn't connect, however, the notes with the hertz distribution. Was it more that what you saw was actually the beat of the music rather than the actual notes?
Yeah, the beat is likely contributing to that periodicity of the EEG oscillation. But in the key thing is in the control, we use the exact same stimuli. So the control condition had the exact same beat. So in that sense, it has to be the musical pattern and the repetition that contributed to the difference in that response that we measured. But definitely when the brain is in training to music, the beat and low frequency characteristics are super important. And I do want to touch on, I'd be skeptical about how much you can extract from the brain in terms of what somebody is physically being exposed to, in fMRI, in terms of, I think that there's a lot of limitations in terms of the degree in which the full diversity of stimuli that you could try to reconstruct what the brain is representing with fMRI. But it is interesting just to point out that fMRI is spatial and vision is spatial. And so one thing to consider is that when you're using fMRI, you're thinking about the deconstructing images. When you use EEG, because EEG involves under the time domain as a temporal resolution, then using stimuli that evolves over time, like music, is something where EEG would be more of a consideration.
Thanks.
So, David, I have another question for you. We didn't speak about movies a lot, but I know that you use the paradigm in your research. And in short, you approximate everyday experiences by short movies. Can you tell us why you do so, and why do you believe this is a appropriate representation of everyday experiences, like short movie pieces?
Yeah, that's so. I did that thing where you write a title and then you don't entirely follow the title. So I did not talk about movies, but we did a study where you can predict which movies people are watching. And the claim there is that, when we think about what we're doing right now, in the way that we really engage with the world, it's actually very complicated. The things that have the most meaning in terms of our relationships are actually very complicated. It's dealing with humans, and it's difficult to measure that in the experimental context. And so that's why I made that claim that movies are a way to do that, because you do have the vision and you have the sound, it unfolds over time, and you have some complex psychological pieces that are involved. And that's why I wanted to kind of look at trying to look at the brain response to movies.
But meanwhile, I just wanted to ask you a very general thing about your work in brainwaves. Like you mentioned the objective cognitive processes versus subjective test reports in more than one of your works. So what is subjective about reporting something? So why do you have to lean in on EEG or fMRI or whatever, and not just ask the person what he or she was feeling?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think one thing is that people are very bad at articulating what they think. And I'm fascinated by that. And there's a whole kind of literature on, there's not always an incentive for humans to understand why they make decisions. They might be actually incentivized not to know why they make decisions, because sometimes our behavior is not to the benefit of ourselves, but it serves a sort of different behavior in the context of our family and our society and our culture. So there was a study that showed that like people's brain responses while they watched The Walking Dead and then they looked at their Twitter tweets. So they were unable to report how engaged they were by The Walking Dead, but they were able to look at that based on their activity online, something along those lines. So basically, there's not always an alignment between what we say we like and what we want and what the actual truth is. And the brain can potentially inform, but I'm kind of interested in how does our behavior online inform that? How do we decide to share information with others and share our own information and like information online? That's one of the aspects of behavior beyond the brain that I think would be super interesting.
All right. Last question for me. Where do you see a future of EEG in everyday life?
and where?
I'm not sure. This brings up. I think that there's the analogy of how humans like to think that they can have control over something, and that all we have to do is solve it ourselves and not fully understand the complexity of something. So, for example, when they figured out what was in breast milk, they were like, okay, we can now make breast milk and it's going to be just the same. But it wasn't. Like, you just can't replicate something that's more complex, but we get deceived into thinking that we can. And then the whole case with, like, when there's a virus out there, our bodies can design antibodies to it. Each of our bodies has the wisdom to begin to create antibodies. But as a culture and society, it takes us a long time to develop those antibodies. And so just appreciating the wisdom of, like, of what our intuition is, and, like, the ability to say, hey, write a piano piece about that sounds like horses riding through the snow. There's wisdom in that. And maybe it's not, doesn't have that control aspect, which can be scary. So basically, I just want to caution against the thought that we can just measure something and then that's something that we should focus on, when there's so much complexity of the individual in our interactions with, which is very meaningful by itself.
Thanks, David. So these are David's info if you want to get in touch. And I want to thank you all once again and thank the MOCO organizers. It's been a lovely couple of days.